It is somewhat of an irony to me that a few days ago in a stream with Sargon we touched upon the topic of left-wing terrorism, of which we here in Germany, as well as our friends and neighbours in Italy, had some experience with in the past. I remember telling him during that stream how these terrorist movements came into existence here, and that in my opinion it is likely that the regressive left in the US and UK might take a similar direction. In Germany we had the RAF, or Rote Armee-Fraktion, which means Red Army faction. Its founders were mainly students out of wealthy families, centered around a core of people gathered around Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof. These people took part in the 1968 student protest movement that flared up all across Germany, and even back then you could see some of the warning signs flaring up, when one of the people who would later become a leading member of the RAF made a short film. This one you're seeing here, which is an instruction on how to make the most effective possible Molotov cocktail. When the 1968 protest movement started to lose its momentum, this group of people, known as the Baader-Meinhof complex, became convinced that peaceful means were not enough to overthrow the state. They believed that the German Republic and its free market was a system that would inevitably lead to the re-emergence of fascist totalitarianism. In their pamphlets, they referred to the German Republic as das System, or the system, and their ideological mind map, which was heavily based upon Maoist tendencies and neo-Marxist gibberish from the Frankfurt School, dictated to them the failure of democracy and the necessity of violence. They disregarded debate within the public forum and even disregarded the democratic left within the Republic, which operated within the field of the public forum in favor of their own more violent means, and justified this by proclaiming that violence was their only means for achieving what they wanted. In their own words, the left has figured out that the revolution cannot be created by them, but by the proletariat. That you have to go into the factories and city districts for the organizational matters. But we believe that the organization of the proletariat is a straw man if you don't start to do what we are doing, which is building a Red Army. Not only did they rationalize a way of disregarding the means and methods of civil society in favor of violence, but as I talked about in my video on the banality of evil, this irrational conviction of absolute truth above all others, and the conviction of having absolute moral superiority, unquestionable, which would justify any means of violence, no matter how extreme, in the name of the supposed greater good, fostered a complete and utter disregard for human life. In their own words, of course we say the cops are pigs. We say the guy in uniform is a pig. He is not a human being, and along those lines of thinking is how we have to confront this. That means we don't have to talk with him, and it is wrong to even consider talking to these people, and of course that allows us to shoot them. This group continued to murder its way through Germany during the late 60s, the 70s, the 80s and the early 90s. Bank robberies, the murder of US soldiers, the planting of bombs at various locations, as well as kidnapping and murdering a politician. The irony of this being that through these deeds they achieved mainly one thing: the ruin of their own image. By crossing the line into committing acts of violence for your beliefs, you will never make yourself friends within the wider public, because it is that very public that you are terrorizing. Quite the opposite, in fact. Today, with the exception of some stupendous Antifa circles in which the RAF has some demonstrable cult status, the wider public regards them as scum. For there is, when it boils down to cold hard facts, only one truth to be said about those who overstep the line into seeing violence as the means by which they wish to further their cause in an open and free society. Once you have overstepped that line, you are no longer an activist, let alone a political figure. You are nothing more but a thug. It is tragic how what happened in Germany during the 1970s and 1980s might now be happening in the United States. But on the other hand, it is not surprising. We have here a group that has built its entire ideological framework around the myth The myth that this is a white supremacist society, that all fellow citizens of a different skin colour are racist, and that violence is justifiable. A position so irrational and untrue that it could never be defended through simple argumentation in any public forum. A position that therefore would never stand the test of a public vote. A position that therefore could only be enforced via violent means. And by legitimizing violence and making excuses for it, you have provided the nurturing ground for this to happen. I just hope that we won't see happening in the United States what happened in Italy during the 1970s and 1980s, when they had to endure the Red Brigades, which was also a left-wing communist terror organization that murdered and brutalized its way through Italy. In Italy, the terror of the fanatics in the left gave legitimacy to the fanatics in the far right, who then started committing their own acts of terror as a reaction, such as the Bologna bombing of 1980 by a fascist terrorist that killed 85 people. I hope what will happen is what we saw happening in Germany during the 1970s and 80s. With the wider public turning away in utter disgust of the thuggish and vile behaviour by the RAF. Better yet would be if the Black Lives Matter movement, organised by wealthy kids for no other purpose but to hijack an actual issue and push ideological nonsense, will now just die off or fade into obscurity. In the end, there's something I would like to say about using violence as a means of pushing your ideology. I'll have to go back to the early 1800s, when revolutionary zeal was running through all of Europe, and the forces of the old monarchies were desperately trying to maintain the pre-French Revolution status quo. Back then, Austria, the Austrian Empire, was run by a guy called Lord Metternich, and from this man is one of my favourite historical quotes of all time. "You can do many things with a bayonet, except sit on it." You see, Metternich's job was to stop republicanism and the revolutionary movements throughout his vast empire, and he did so not through arguing the case for monarchy on the pedestal of any kind of open forum, but through raw, ruthless violence, setting up a bayonet, so to speak, by creating a brutal police state that surveilled over every aspect of society in a period of history known as the Biedermeier. But here's the thing about this approach. By resorting to violence, he automatically admitted that he didn't have a case to argue for and that his position was indefensible with words. The only way he could defend his position was by the bayonet, and this meant that he had to push all his resources into that bayonet. The regime could never rest on its bayonet, for resting would have meant arguing and confronting the opposition. Resorting to the bayonet was an admission of defeat, an admission that the bayonet was the only thing he could ever argue his case with. And when Metternich died and the bayonet was briefly laid aside, the entire empire, from Hungary to Serbia to Austria itself, went up in revolt in what was the start of its long collapse. Let me address the people who in the last 2 years have decided that their case was indefensible on the public forum of a free society and can only be made by the use of force. You can do many things with a Molotov cocktail, except sit on it. You can do many things with your fists, except sit on them. You can do many things with your gun, except sit on it.